My father threw a party after kicking me out, then came begging 2 weeks later. My name is Natalie. I'm 26 years old, and when I was 20, my father kicked me out of the house, then threw a backyard party that same weekend, like getting rid of me was some kind of personal victory. If that sounds cruel, I promise the truth is somehow worse. Because it wasn't just one explosive moment. It was years of being treated like the failure in my own family, until the final humiliation felt almost inevitable. I grew up with my father, my stepmother Linda, and my younger half-brother Mason. My mom had left when I was 9 and moved to another state with a new husband. We were never close after that, so my father liked to remind me that he was the one who stayed and did all the hard parts. He brought that up anytime I disagreed with him, as if parenting me had been some massive favor I should spend my entire life repaying. My father believed there were only two kinds of people in the world: winners and embarrassments. He said things like that all the time, usually over dinner, like he was sharing wise life advice. Mason, of course, was a winner. He was good at sports, popular, naturally funny, and exactly the type of son my father understood. Mason could forget homework, break rules, and mouth off. And somehow my father would call it confidence. If I made a mistake, it became proof that I was weak, irresponsible, or too emotional. I wasn't wild or lazy. I was just different. I liked reading, baking, and anything creative. I was the kind of person who needed time to make decisions. And in my father's house, taking time was seen as a character flaw. After high school, I enrolled in community college because it was affordable and because I honestly didn't know what else to do. I was trying to figure out whether I wanted to study early childhood education or design, and my father hated that I didn't already have a 5-year plan. I worked part-time at a local diner to pay for gas, books, and my phone. I even gave Linda money every month because she said groceries were expensive and I was old enough to contribute. Still, somehow, I was always treated like I was freeloading. My father kept comparing me to people my age who had already transferred to 4-year schools, gotten engaged, joined the military, or started careers. It never mattered that most of those people had support systems, stable homes, or parents who didn't insult them every time they sat down to eat. The person who kept me sane was my grandmother Ruth, my father's mother. She was the only one in the family who called me just to ask how I was doing, instead of what I was doing wrong. She lived nearby in a small townhouse and always made me feel like I could breathe. She used to say, "Some people bloom late, and that doesn't make them weeds." My father hated when she defended me. He'd say she was babying me, but I think he just couldn't stand anyone interrupting his favorite story about me being the problem. Things got worse the year Mason started high school. He became the center of everything. Every game, every grade, every tiny achievement turned into a full family event. At the same time, I was juggling classes and longer shifts at the diner because one of the cooks had quit. I was exhausted all the time. I started dropping one class each semester just to keep up with work, and that gave my father more material. He'd say, "At this rate, you'll graduate when you're 40. Linda would laugh like it was harmless teasing. One night, I mentioned that the diner owner had offered to train me in bookkeeping and scheduling because I was organized and good with customers. I said it might lead to a management position later if college took longer than expected. My father looked at me and said, "So your dream is to become assistant manager at a diner? Aim high, Natalie." Mason snorted into his drink. I stopped telling them anything after that. The final month before he kicked me out was unbearable. My father had started this weird habit of making jokes about getting his house back. If I left my shoes by the door, he'd say, "Countdown to freedom." If I was studying at the kitchen table, he'd ask, "How long until this office clears out?" Even Linda joined in. She once smiled and said, "Maybe when Natalie finally launches, we'll turn her room into a gym." I tried to ignore it, but it wore me down. It wasn't just that they wanted me gone eventually. It was that they enjoyed reminding me I didn't belong. The actual fight started over something small, which is how these things usually happen. I came home late from the diner on a Friday because a server had called out and I covered the closing shift. When I got home, the kitchen was a mess from one of Mason's friends coming over after a game. There were pizza boxes, dirty cups, and soda cans everywhere. Linda saw me come in and said, "Before you go upstairs, clean this up." I was tired, hungry, and still smelling like coffee and fryer oil. I said, "Why am I cleaning up after Mason's friends?" Linda's face changed immediately. "Because you live here too." I said, "I wasn't even here." My father had been watching TV in the next room, and the second he heard my tone, he walked in. "What's going on?" Linda said, "Your daughter thinks she's too good to help around here." That turned into one of those impossible conversations where the original issue stops mattering. Suddenly, it was about my attitude, my future, my lack of gratitude, and how everyone in the house was tired of walking on eggshells around me. I remember standing there stunned because nobody had ever walked on eggshells around me. They said whatever they wanted all the time. I tried defending myself. I said I worked, I paid money toward groceries, I went to school, and I wasn't their maid. That last part really set my father off. He stepped closer and told me if I hated living there so much, I was free to leave. I said, maybe I should. He looked almost pleased. Then he said, maybe you should. Linda crossed her arms and watched me like she'd been waiting for this. Mason came into the hallway, clearly listening. My father pointed toward the stairs and said, pack your stuff. I'm done with this. I thought he was bluffing. I really did. But then he smiled in this cold, ugly way and said, actually, this works out great. We were having people over Sunday anyway. And the look in his eyes told me he already had an idea that made my stomach drop before he even said another word. At first, I still thought my father was just trying to scare me. He had threatened things before, like taking my car or charging me more rent, but this felt different. There was a kind of excitement in him that night, like he had finally found the perfect excuse to get rid of me without looking like the bad guy in his own head. I said, you're seriously kicking me out over this? He folded his arms and said, no, Natalie. I'm kicking you out because I'm tired of your attitude, your excuses, and your constant disrespect. Linda stood beside him, nodding like he was delivering a thoughtful speech instead of throwing his daughter out over dirty dishes she hadn't even touched. Mason stayed halfway hidden in the hallway, watching everything with that uncomfortable look people get when they know something is wrong but don't want to risk becoming the next target. I asked, when am I supposed to leave? My father said, by Sunday afternoon. It was Friday night. I stared at him and said, that's 2 days. He shrugged. Then I suggest you use them wisely. I ended up calling my grandmother from my room while trying not to cry too loudly. The second she heard my voice, she asked what happened. I told her my father was kicking me out, and she went dead silent for about 3 seconds before saying, pack what you need, you're coming here. I will never forget how calm she sounded. Not because she wasn't angry, but because she knew I needed one adult in that moment who wasn't making everything worse. Saturday was miserable. My father acted cheerful all morning. He even whistled while mowing the lawn. Linda cleaned the patio furniture. I thought maybe they were pretending everything was normal because neighbors were around. But then Mason let it slip that my father had invited family friends over for burgers and drinks on Sunday. I said, you're seriously having people over while I'm moving out? Mason looked embarrassed and said, Dad joked that it was a fresh start party. A fresh start party. I felt sick. Sunday afternoon, I carried boxes out to my grandmother's car while my father arranged folding chairs in the backyard. Around 3, the first guests started arriving. A couple from down the street, my father's friend Greg and his wife, then 2 of Linda's sisters. My father was actually smiling and greeting people while I was still loading my life into a trunk. At one point, I heard Greg laugh and say, so this is the celebration? And my father replied, loud enough for me to hear, yep, empty nest, 1 kid at a time. Some people laughed, not everyone, but enough. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. My grandmother heard it too. She froze with one hand on a box and looked at my father in pure disgust. She said, loud and clear, one day, you're going to be ashamed of yourself. My father rolled his eyes and said, oh, come on, Mom. She's 20, not 12. This is called accountability. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I was either going to scream or completely fall apart in front of half the neighborhood. So I just got in my grandmother's car and left. I cried the entire drive to her townhouse. Living with my grandmother was cramped, but peaceful. She gave me her spare room, helped me reorganize my work schedule, and refused to let me call myself a burden. 2 days after I moved in, the owner of the diner asked if I wanted more hours because one of the morning supervisors had quit suddenly. I said yes immediately. Then Ruth helped me apply for a short bookkeeping certificate at the community college so I could actually build on the work the owner wanted to teach me. For the first time in years, my life felt quiet enough to think. Then, exactly 2 weeks after my father's little celebration, there was a knock on my grandmother's front door. It was him. He looked stressed, sweaty, and nowhere near as confident as he had in his backyard. I stepped onto the porch before my grandmother could get there, and he said my name like we were in the middle of some normal disagreement. I asked, what do you want? He rubbed the back of his neck and said, I need a favor. I actually laughed because it sounded unreal. Turns out, Mason had taken my father's truck without permission, backed it into a retaining wall, and caused more damage than he wanted to admit. Insurance was a mess because Mason wasn't supposed to be driving it. On top of that, one of Linda's sisters had apparently told half the family about the party, and now people were calling my father cruel, childish, and heartless. My grandmother's comment had spread too. He was suddenly getting judged by the same relatives he usually performed for. Then came the real reason he was there. He wanted me to tell people there was no bad blood, that I left by choice, and that the party had been misunderstood as a joke. I stared at him and said, you want me to fix your image? He said, I want this family drama to calm down. I asked, did you come here to apologize? He hesitated, and that tiny pause told me everything. Then he said, I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. That was it. Not sorry for humiliating me. Not sorry for celebrating. Not sorry for throwing me out with nowhere to go except the one relative he constantly mocked for helping me. I told him no. No, I would not lie for him. No, I would not tell people it was a misunderstanding. And no, I was not coming back to make his life easier. He got angry almost instantly and said I was being vindictive. I told him he had thrown a party because I was gone, so he should enjoy the peace he worked so hard for. He left furious. Now, some relatives say I was right to shut the door. A few think I should have helped smooth things over because he's still my father. My grandmother says consequences finally knocked on his door, and he just didn't like meeting them. So tell me honestly, was I wrong for refusing to protect him after what he did? Would you ever forgive a parent for publicly humiliating you like that? And if he comes back with a real apology, should I even listen? Let me know in the comments.